All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Solomon Cochren. I am chairing this panel, Black Power, Black Prophecy, and Black Faith. And so we have three great panelists. And so we're just asking that we'll follow the order that is in the program. And we'll ask as the panelists would just as they're before they're presenting, they would present their name, affiliation, and research interests. We're asking that everyone keep their presentations around 15 minutes. And then also those that are listening, be mindful of taking notes because we will have time for Q&A as things strike you as they are presenting. So without further ado, our first panelist. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
All right, Tom, you up.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't hear. My paper is The Prophetic Fire Next Time, The Dialectic of Belonging and Exile in James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Uh, this is still a paper in progress. I presented it at RCA as a paper in progress and have modified it since then, reforming my ideas, doing some more research. But I'm not a Baldwin expert, but I fell in love with The Fire Next Time and I just felt compelled to write on it. So I'm going to go ahead and start my timer here so I know how much time I have. So to sort of get quickly to the point, Baldwin is early in the book. He writes a letter to his nephew, which is reminiscent of the pastoral epistles in the New Testament. So you start to see early in the rhetoric that he is both overtly and subtly employing Christian imagery, symbolism, referring to its linguistic universe. He also is appealing to the Black prophetic tradition. So in the second section of the book, he tells what really amounts to a spiritual autobiography that is reminiscent of both the American Puritans, but also, more importantly for him, Black prophetic figures like Jarena Lee, Julia Foote, Richard Allen, and Frederick Douglass. So to skip a whole bunch of stuff at the beginning, he is just saturating his work with religious language. But the irony of using a religious genre and religious rhetoric lies in the fact that Baldwin, throughout The Fire Next Time, notes repeatedly his disinterest, distrust, and disbelief in the church and the God of the church. He laments the church's desire for safety and their unnoticed equation of safety with religious. He laments the church's desire for he grieves the way the church turns Black girls into either prostitutes or moral boundary keepers for boys. He criticizes the way the church has failed to give Black men the language of oppression and liberation. And he criticizes the church for demonizing the power that is needed to resist whiteness. So, based on his direct experience preaching and teaching in his stepfather's church, Baldwin came to believe that the Black church's God is likely white-skinned. And the church structures worked like what he calls a racket that cultivated moral blindness rather than Christian virtue. Therefore, he explains, and here's where you start to notice the dialectical tension I'm going to talk a lot about. He explains, I was saved, church religious language, but at the same time, I realized immediately that I could not remain in the church merely as another worshiper. The tension between belonging and exile provides the material analysis for this essay. In The Fire Next Time, Baldwin positions himself in what I am going to call the prophetic dialectical tension, which articulates the ambiguities of belonging in a community while also experiencing exile for criticizing that same community. Herein, I argue that the first half of Baldwin's autobiographical material situates him not merely in the realm of the religious or even the Christian, but in the tradition of prophetic figures found in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the African American prophetic tradition. while noticing Baldwin's prophetic disposition is not new. So this is, in other words, when you read secondary literature on Baldwin, often people are happy to refer to him as a prophet. But what this essay contributes is an attentiveness to the how of his prophecy, his masterful discursive navigation, his adoption of the persona and generic restraints of the prophetic of these various traditions that allows him to rhetorically identify with, indeed belong to, the Black church readers. We also note that given the nature of prophetic rhetoric, Baldwin subverts audience expectations. So he builds himself up, it's sort of this prophetic figure with this religious appeal, but then he subverts our expectations, that prophets often do. And in this subversion of expectations, he threatens his position in the community. He does this by breaking down secular sacred binaries and identifying continually as one outside the community. So the religious rhetoric brings him into the community, but the prophetic rhetoric sort of positions him outside the community. The prophetic genre announces his membership in the Black church's rhetorical universe, while at the same time guaranteeing that they will reject him. So defending this thesis entails first defining prophetic rhetoric and overviewing the relevant rhetorical models for understanding Baldwin's discursive tactics. Thereafter, we examine the methodology through close reading, some of Baldwin's specific prophetic statements, and tie them to the dialectical tension of belonging and exile. Finally, we put together some implications. I am not going to be able to go into all the detail I wish, so we're not going to hit all of that. But let's start with prophetic rhetoric. Historically, the primary emphasis in rhetoric scholarship has fallen on persuasion and effect. That is, whether a discursive act employs appropriate means to produce the desired outcome within a rhetorical situation. However, Edwin Black noted that discursive effectiveness cannot tell the full story. An audience's ethos plays an equally important role. So we were talking, I think Kelly earlier, we were talking about audience responsibility. It's not just audience responsibility. It is audience responsibility in the moment to respond to the speaker, but it's also audience responsibility outside the moment to have the kind of character that can hear this message. So for Black, sometimes even appropriate discourse, well-crafted arguments, and oral excellence fails to persuade because an audience, not the speaker, the audience enters the rhetorical situation with a contrary moral disposition, an ethos that is incapable of hearing the message. No one knows this better than prophetic figures, whose various rhetorical situations, even within their own community, almost always entail engaging audiences who live in an alternative moral and linguistic universe that inhibits their ability to hear. Thus, despite prophetic figures generating some of the most creative discursive artifacts in literature and oratory, their immediate audiences often scapegoat, sideline, ignore, exile, and even martyr them. While prophetic discourse may desire effect, especially when they're speaking to their own communities, prior awareness of an audience's implacability necessitates prophets assess their success by alternative measurements than whether the audience faithfully responds. Namely, the prophets appraise their rhetorical success by whether their rhetoric faithfully posits an alternative socio-political and theological reality. By whether it faithfully posits an alternative socio-political and theological reality. This is, for example, the problem Baldwin experiences in his stepfather's church in Harlem. Baldwin understands the rituals, liturgies, and longings of the community. Yet he finds these troubling because at the bottom of their religious experience, he believes that no alternative imagination is insisting upon their lives. Instead, religion has become synonymous with safety, and their consciousness exists easily within the ideologies of whiteness. So to counter this ideological, theological, and moral capitulation requires an alternative kind of rhetoric, a different linguistic universe, not beholden to or defined by the dominant discourse, in Baldwin's case, whiteness. The goal of prophetic rhetoric lies neither in persuasion nor judgment nor reconciliation nor apocalyptic visions, but simply the positing of an alternative discourse that stuns rather than numbs. Yet, when you stun your community with prophetic discourse, you generate the likelihood of exile from that community. People feel comfortable in their numbness. To stun them will excite their rage. So we got to skip ahead, but one way that Baldwin navigates this tension is through the use of narrative. While Baldwin begins the Fire Next Time with an epistolary introduction, reminiscent of the pastoral epistles in the Bible, the body of his text offers an autobiographical narrative reminiscent of historical Black spiritual autobiographies. The generic choice of narrative rather than syllogistic argumentation already tells us a lot about his objective. He does not desire debate, dialogue, or deliberation. Rather, he invites his audience into a narrative universe, a summons to feel his feelings with him, not merely think thoughts against him. More, the specific choice of a narrative spiritual autobiography rhetorically places Baldwin in the line of prophetic figures his audience recognizes and authorizes. They recognize and authorize Jarena Lee, Julia Foote, Richard Allen. But most tellingly, and I think he doesn't make this connection, but I am, most tellingly, and not at all coincidentally, the genre of spiritual autobiography also includes Frederick Douglass, who employed religious language and adopted prophetic disposition, but did not identify as a Christian or participate in the Christian community. So like Douglass before him, Baldwin does not give up the prophetic mantle when he exits the church and the pulpit. He does not assume, and this is, I think, key, he does not assume a secular sacred dichotomy. The prophetic figures have to break these false binaries down. Rather, he recognizes that prophets in the biblical tradition and Black history often had no immediate ecclesial roles, as they frequently had to denounce the institutions and linguistic universes those roles supported. So, importantly then, prophecy refuses to submit to the false dichotomy that limits its rhetorical power to the spiritual realm. Avoiding secular, sacred, or public-private paradigms, Baldwin must rhetorically acknowledge the ecclesial rhetoric while also, at the same time, distancing himself from the ecclesia because of its failure to live up to the historical burden of its prophetic task. Thus, he laments how the Black church has fallen into the same moral blindness, loneliness, and terror as the white church. By adopting the persona of a prophetic figure and the generic restraints of prophetic rhetoric, Baldwin calls the church to its highest ideals. He says he wishes more than anything for the church to embody the decidedly biblical values of faith, hope, and charity. I want to address one specific example of belonging in exile, and it's from a narrative in his book. Particularly telling for the claim that Baldwin has adopted a prophetic disposition both within and against the church is the story of attending his friend's church and meeting a Black female preacher who, quote, sat in robes, smiling, extremely proud and handsome woman with Africa, Europe, and America of the American Indian blended in her face. Having had a difficult relationship with his stepfather, Baldwin finds himself impressed and safe with this woman. Indeed, her question, "Whose little boy are you?" displays both his breakdown of the secular sacred binary and his belonging to the Black church community. He had first heard the question on the lips of, quote, the pimps and racketeers, who invited him to spend time with them. Yet her question tapped into his natural human longing to belong because, quote, I unquestionably wanted to be somebody's little boy. While this may lead us to assume Baldwin assumes a moral rift between the church and the pimps and the racketeers on the street, he nevertheless follows these musings with the statement that binds them together. It was my good luck, perhaps, that I found myself in the church racket instead of something other, and surrendered to spiritual seduction long before I came to any carnal knowledge. Thus, he admits to belonging to the church, but his language still demonstrates the prophetic dialectical tension. Now, all of this comes to a climax one night when his guilt and fear came roaring, screaming, crying out, and he felt compelled and he fell to the ground at the altar. In what follows, Baldwin describes the experience of ecstasy often associated with prophetic figures in the biblical and African American tradition. Like Nat Turner before him, Baldwin's experience of ecstasy or seizure marks him in the audience's imagination as one submitting to the spirit of prophecy. The irony, of course, lies in the fact that the moment dismantles his faith. He displays all the signs and symbols of the possession of the spirit, while at the same time announcing, "All I remember is the pain, the unspeakable pain. It was as though I were yelling up to heaven, and heaven would not hear me." He belongs to God, yet experiences exile from God, just as he belongs to the community while experiencing exile from the community. This comes out explicitly when he wakes from his ecstasy, and the church announces his salvation. He both affirms this belonging and subverts their claim, risking exile, when he says, "Well, indeed, I was, in a way, for I was utterly drained and exhausted and released for the first time from all my guilty torment," right? This is a salvation testimony. "I was aware then only of my relief. For many years, I could not ask myself why human relief had to be achieved in such a fashion at once so pagan and so desperate, in a fashion at once so unspeakably old and unutterably new." All right, so I have 15 seconds left. So the prophetic task is to denounce that which the community considers sacred, right? So you have to be an insider enough to know what the community considers sacred, and then you have to risk exile by denouncing those things it considers sacred. So what he does throughout the rest of the book is he desacralizes his father and the patriarchy. He desacralizes the scriptures and their authors. He desacralizes the nation and its mythologies, and he desacralizes the Black church community and its institutions. I could go on and on here, but I want to respect everybody else's time. I'm 30 seconds over, so I'll be happy to answer any further questions. Thank you for giving me time.
Thank you, Tom. Next, we'll have, I believe it's Josh Harper.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Let me pull up here.
Hey, Josh, introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yep. I am Josh Harper. I am housing director here at Meridian Community College. I received my Master of Divinity from Memphis Theological Seminary, and I also got my Master's in Higher Education Administration at Mississippi College. Got my bachelor's degree from Bethel University, where I majored in social work. My research interests are primarily in Black nationalism, and kind of exploring some of the Black nationalist movements and what have you. So here we go.
And we do appreciate your stole that's hanging in the back there.
I dog, I forgot, that's our little thing, right? That's our little thing. Shout out to Phi Beta Sigma, the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity incorporated. And thank you, Dr. J, for this opportunity. And I can go on and on about that. So I appreciate you. Much love to you. All right, I wanna title my presentation. It's not real short, but it's packed with some good stuff. I want to title it "When the Good News Isn't Good Enough: Comparing and Contrasting Civil Rights Rhetoric and Black Power Rhetoric." I opened this presentation by sharing a poem from Walter Everett Hawkins in 1909, and it's entitled "Too Much Religion." There's too much time for doctrine, too much talk of church and creeds, far too little time for duty and to heal some heart that bleeds. Too much Sunday church religion, too many stale and bookish prayers. Too many souls are getting ragged, watching what their neighbor wears. There's too much talk of heaven, too much talk of golden streets. When one can't be sympathetic, when when a needy neighbor meets. Too much talk about the riches you expect to get, and I quote up there, when one will not do his duty as a decent Christian down here. And you needn't think of the angels have no other work to do but to stitch on fancy garments to be packed away for you. For some people live so crooked, those robes may refuse to fit. Let us have less talk of heaven and do right just a little bit. Hawkins, who was agnostic, asserts in his poem also Credo, I believe in justice and freedom. To see liberty is priestly and kingly. Freedom is my bride, liberty is my angel of light, and justice is my God. He seems to suggest that the decentering of an institution, more namely the Black church, is not within the effective possibilities of seeking Black liberation, justice, self-determination, and agency. There's been an overwhelmingly number of seminal figures, particularly during the civil rights movement, who identified as Christian and credited their faith practice to be the impetus of their struggle for justice on behalf of Black people, including but not limited to such notable people as James Cone, Albert Clegg, and of course, Dr. King. These individuals stand oftentimes in contrast to other Black power figures such as Malcolm X, Kwame Ture, or better known as Stokely Carmichael, and co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton. The point of departure between those of the civil rights movement and those of the Black Power movement was typically the affirming of the Black church as a staple for liberation, tenets of Christian faith, such as love, compassion, and reconciliation, and acts of violence committed or advocate to be committed on white oppressors. Dr. King, the drum major for justice and proponent of peaceful activism, drew heavily on Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence resistance as a tool for social change and justice. However, as the civil rights movement began to heat up in the late 1950s, King, unbeknownst to many, was interested in firearms for he and his family's protection. After having his house bombed, according to Cornell professor of law at UCLA, Adam Winkler, King applied for a permit to carry a concealed weapon. In Winkler's book entitled Gunfight, the preacher from Georgia applied for a concealed carry permit in Alabama in 1956. Eventually, King gave up any hope of armed self-defense and fully embraced nonviolence, even though one can infer that his longing for peaceful protest was becoming a thorn in his side as he didn't get a chance to render his sermon, Why America May Go to Hell. However, Dr. King's commitment to equality under the guise of being Christ-like hampered any opportunity to become a Black militant. It was as if his fundamental commitment to the church deemed him incapable of being publicly explicit about what he was completely harboring regarding white supremacy. Founder of the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit, Michigan, Albert Clegg, referring to the oppressed in Jesus' day, wrote in his text, Black Christian Nationalism, New Directions for the Black Church, said, understood that the diabolical outcomes that stem from investing in white institutions. He said, and I quote, the institutions of the enemy are the basis of your oppression and exploitation. He goes on to admit that so long as institutions are permitted to exercise unchallenged power in serving the interests of the enemy, the oppressed are helpless. Institutions are the basis of the white oppressor's power. They were created to serve his interests. As oppressed Black people, we have a different relationship with American institutions from that of the white oppressor. That which serves his interests cannot possibly serve ours. As Clegg paralleled those in the first century who were the least, last, and left out to the plight of Black people, he asserted, but having no institutions of their own, they had no power. Clegg's prescription for a revolutionary alternative was primarily centered on having a Black church. Thus, he defends the church because he believes this is the only way Black people can wield sustainable power. While seminaries are disappearing, physical church attendance is decreasing, and the overall optimistic attitudes Blacks once held about the Black church has changed, and not necessarily for the better. This offering that Clegg provided has limited effectiveness. if any at all, in modern day. And it displays rhetorical cleverness, even though a black nationalist is only willing to go so far in his ecclesiastical detachments as he envelops his critique within preserving the institutional black church. Then there's the father of Black liberation theology himself, Dr. James L. Cone. In God of the Oppressed, Cone argues that, and I quote, we cannot let white rhetoric about nonviolence and Jesus distort our vision of violence committed against Black people. Therefore, one of the tasks of the Black ethicist is to untangle the confused and much discussed problem of violence and nonviolence of Jesus' relationship to both. At least 3 points ought to be made. Violence is not only what Black people do to white people as victims seek to change structure of their existence, it is also what white people did when they created a society for white people only and what they do in order to maintain it. Violence in America did not begin with the Black Power movement or with the Black Panther Party. Neither is it limited to the Sudanese Liberation Army. Contrary to popular white opinion, violence has a long history in America. This country was born in violent revolution, and it has been sustained by the violent extermination of red people and violent enslavement of Black people. Excuse me. This is what Rap Brown had in mind when he said that violence is America as cherry pie. White people have a distorted conception of the meaning of violence. They like to think of violence as breaking the laws of their society, but that is a narrow and racist understanding of reality. There's a much more deadly form of violence, and it is camouflaged in such slogans as law and order, freedom and democracy, and the American way of life. I continue, Cone said, therefore, that the problem of violence is not the problem of a new Black revolutionaries, but the problem of a whole social structure which outwardly appears to be ordered and respectable, but inwardly is ridden by psychopathic obsessions and delusions, racism and hatred. But in all of Cone's powerful prophetic proclamations, it does not come without its share of controversy. He says in the very same text in his final chapter on racial reconciliation, I'm not ruling out the rare possibility of conversion among white oppressors. There can be no forgiveness of sins without repentance, and no repentance without the gift of faith to struggle with and for the freedom of the oppressed. He goes on to articulate when whites undergo the true experience of conversion, wherein they die to whiteness and are reborn in order to struggle against white oppression and for the liberation of the oppressed, there is a place for them in the Black struggle freedom. The waffling between needful and necessary indictments of white oppressors and qualifications for them to turn from their wicked ways causes me angst, a hermeneutic suspicion, if you will, simply because I contend he sees a fundamental distinction between mandates of Christian faith and mandates of liberation. Consider even his book titles, Black Theology and Black Power, or Martin and Malcolm and America. The very presence of these contradictions always causes chaos and cognitive dissonance within Black life and liberation. Liberation has to be either or and not both and. Reason being, there is no contradiction between white supremacy, Christianity, and lynching of Black folks. But for Black theologians such as Cone to attempt to try and reconcile white evil with the possibility of having a Damascus Road experience is to try and hold on to a moralism that preserves the very theology that enslaved Black people. And in the words of Dr. Matt King Carter, to have the same theology as a slave master is mental illness. Malcolm X stridently and insightfully asserted in his autobiography that Christianity was the white man's religion, created to enslave Black people and affirm white values. Malcolm was clear, which is why after serving 6 years in prison, the Nation of Islam was the only thing that made sense to him, because the Nation of Islam provided an essential and perhaps only foundation for the Black Power movement. The nation emphasized Black pride, economic independence, rejection of racial reconciliation. It insisted on individual discipline and self-defense against physical and psychological violence perpetrated by white society. And as Malcolm would later say, all by any means necessary. So whether we're talking about Malcolm X, Kwame Ture, who popularized the term Black Power, these unapologetic revolutionists were clear. Either Black people are to be self-determined or they perish. I define Black self-determination by the virtue of what they freely determine how they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development without centering Christian ideals. And as chief theorist of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton believed religion was an ideology that served as an opiate for the people rather than as a stimulant for independent thinking and action. What to make of all of this? Well, I believe that if Black power is to be actualized, it must decenter Christianity as the launching pad for achieving Black liberation and unity. It must have an ardent stance on reconciliation, that there is and never will be reconciliation of Black people with the white masses. And lastly, that if acts of violence are carried out on Blacks, it is without hesitation, reservation, and apology that violence must be the response. So, to echo the words of Mother Fannie Lou Hamer, I keep a shotgun in every corner of my bedroom. And the first cracker even looked like he wants to throw some dynamite on my porch. He won't write his mama again.
Thank you very much. And bringing in the rear is Carl. Carl, you are up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cochren. I really appreciate you. And thanks so much for this opportunity to Dr. Johnson, who I can say I'm a proud Johnsonian here at the University of Memphis, first year PhD student. Dr. Johnson and I agree on a lot of things. And so it's just, I'm not going to make any comments about blue and white, but, to quote the historian Walter H. Mazik, 8 men thoroughly immersed in the true Omega spirit. That I'll say that and I'll keep moving.
Yeah, that's enough said right there. That's enough
That's
said.
enough. That's all we need. So I'm going to be presenting. I've witnessed too much hell right here. It's a rhetorical analysis of Pastor Troy's 2001 release, vice versa. So I'll read. Let me set my timer just to make sure that I stay as respectful as possible. Michael Troy, better known as hip hop artist Pastor Troy's 2001 song entitled Vice Versa, is arguably a hip hop masterpiece. This song creates a hypothetical inverse of what is understood as heaven and hell. To begin, Pastor Troy's understanding of heaven and hell in his song is the eschatological eternity from a Christian perspective. Troy utilizes his lyrical genius to convey the difference between heaven and hell and the potential of the difference between the two to describe his reality. That is, heaven and hell being opposite, heaven is hell and hell is heaven, is a tool he uses to explain his reality. Troy states, if heaven was hell and vice versa, I have no fear. I've witnessed too much hell right here. This line is the axis of this writing. Troy's statement suggests that if the eschaton is different from what is traditionally described, his present condition of living in hell completely alleviates his fear of an eternal hell. In short, he has lived in hell consistently. We must consider then, what is hell for Troy? What are the living conditions and understanding of hell/the underworld where he makes this conclusion? Troy's vice versa is beyond lyrical genius. His verse in this song deals with different areas considered academic disciplines. Troy's verse shows an astute understanding of theology, Black spirituality, rhetoric, prophetic rhetoric, philosophy, etc. His words constitute a rhetorical strategy to convey the complexities of the reality of suffering in light of the abstract or metaphysical concept of the afterlife. However, these lyrics, his words, are often not considered worthy of critical rhetorical analysis. Rhetoric as an academic discipline has vast boundaries of what is considered rhetoric. However vast the boundaries are, margins lead to marginalization. This is not to suggest that hip hop has not been considered as rhetoric. Hip hop and rhetoric can be traced back to the late 20th century. I do not attempt in this writing to critique the dominant culture of rhetoric, but to provide insight into how the borders of rhetoric can be broadened, or perhaps another subdiscipline that gives voice to what is considered the margins of the discipline. According to McCarroll, rhetorical criticism must be shaped by taking part in the culture and society. That is, a part of doing the work of critical rhetoric is not in the theoretical constructs that question communication methods, but rather allowing critical rhetoric to be drawn out of the critic being immersed in the culture. If culture is the medium through which humans interact, critical rhetoric can draw much more from being immersed in the everyday engagement of culture. Subsequently, the critic can find the technical theories of rhetoric in what would be considered mundane and or universal. This is where we find the gem of Troy's song. Troy is not considered a mainstream hip hop artist, nor has any of his music received any dominant culture awards. However, on the fringes of the hip hop community, his voice cries out. As a result of considering the wealth of rhetoric in this song, this paper will analyze the song in light of contemporary and critical rhetorical theories. Further, this paper will attempt to view his song, as McCarroll states, as a part of the culture. This is not to suggest that hip hop has not been considered as rhetoric. However, much attention can be given to this song and the song to broaden the horizons. Let's move. Yep, I'm good on time. Olga Davis argues that space should be created to consider the rhetoric of Black women. Her premise for creating space for Black women in the field of rhetoric is due to the muting or obfuscation of their voices in the academic discipline of rhetoric. I must agree with Davis. Also, I do not wish to attempt to appropriate the argument specifically for Black women and the voices of Black women. Davis's Davis is intentional in creating a space specifically for Black women in rhetorical criticism. It should stand alone as an entity in and of itself. My argument is not in terms of appropriation as it is in terms of form of inspiration. In the same fashion that Davis argues a space in rhetorical criticism is needed for Black women, the same can be said about a plethora of facets of Black life. Like Black feminism, different forms of Black life and rhetorical criticism must challenge the academic hegemony. It is the framework from Davis that we consider vice versa. First, rhetoric is a discourse part of any human communication. Rhetoric is a natural and social fact of human interaction. Understanding rhetoric in a universal sense allows critics to look at all elements of human discourse through a rhetorical lens. Rhetoric, then, is not only a tool of persuasion, but rather a tool to facilitate understanding. Since Fleming considers rhetoric anthropological, then it must be an expression of one's ontology as well. That is, when considering the elements of rhetoric language as signs and signifiers, then creating understanding must be an expression of one's being. Or, of course, conveying a theory or is conveying a system developed to understand sign and signifier. Thus, who a person is anthropologically is associated with how a person seeks to facilitate understanding, which of course broadens the lens of what should be considered the technical sense of rhetoric. Critical rhetoric then seeks to bridge the gap between the universal and the technical. Critical rhetoric, according to Becquerel, comes out of the culture, thus being a part of the culture. Rhetorical strategy to broaden the horizons of what should be considered technical from the universal is where our attention shall turn to this hip hop song. Also, along the lines of Davis, hip hop as critical rhetoric does not need to be included in the canon, but space must be given for consideration. Chavez states this essay is not to dismiss what people hold sacred, but rather to show how there are other ways of being in the rhetorical world. Further, the purpose of doing critical rhetoric is to undermine and expose the discourse of power in order to thwart its effects in its social relation. The essence of this purpose of critical rhetoric can be seen within the lyrics of vice versa. Again, Troy is dealing with elements of the discourse of power and how is made manifest in his reality. He emphatically states, I have witnessed too much hell right here. Hell, from a Christian lens, has a few discursive elements to be considered, all of which are associated with power. In hell, there's the discourse of punishment, torture, judgment, damnation, isolation, and othering. The first question must be, who has created and or sustained a hell that is not eschatological? Further, what power gets to execute judgment and punishment? To expose the discourse of power, these questions must be answered through an exegetical approach to these lyrics as artifact. Vice versa begins with Pastor Troy framing the subsequent lyrics in the song. He begins by saying, picture everything that you thought was good was really bad, and everything bad was really good. In framing this, there's a subtle ad lib prior to this frame. He states, I'm doing my best to save my people. At the outset of the song, his framing confronts philosophical elements of what is good and what is bad, but also situates the song as prophetic rhetoric. According to Johnson, prophetic rhetoric is a discourse grounded in the sacred and rooted in the community experience that offers a critique of existing communities and traditions by charging and challenging society to live up to the ideals expounded while offering celebration and hope for a brighter future. Prophetically, Troy's intent for this consideration of heaven and hell is to save his people. In light of Johnson's definition, we should not limit prophecy or prophetic rhetoric as sacred to the theist. His intent for this song is to provide thoughts that will hopefully save his people. The purpose of any prophetic utterance is to provide hope for a better future, salvation, in the face of impending danger or gloom. That is Troy's song, which we would consider secular, is in fact prophetic. As a result of this song, Pastor Troy has been labeled as an antichrist and even demonic. However, this song is rooted in the sacred. Saving his people by this prophetic utterance aligns with the definition of prophetic rhetoric. There is an insinuation that prophetic message must come from the divine. Troy states, I want to make you use your mind. God has sent a sign, insinuating that the sign of the times and the urgency to adhere to the prophetic message is indeed from God. Although the song may be considered anti-God, Troy suggests that these words are from God. Although abrasive and possibly offensive, the prophetic message must be spoken. However difficult the circumstances, there is hope through the eyes of the pen of the prophet. According to Cone, what separates the blues from the spiritual is the hope that the spirituals provide. That is, the hope of the prophetic rhetoric is in the song itself. There is no coincidence in Cone's assessment of the spiritual and the poetic nature of Hebrew Bible prophecy. The prophet laments in the hope of better days. Troy sings of turmoil of the present, but the song in itself is in hope of a brighter day. In short, he questions the inverse of heaven and hell in search of a day that looks more optimistic than what he is facing in the here and now. The essence of the questioning, the difference is to save his people. The model of heaven and hell proven to conflict with the bettering of his people. Thus, prophetically, there must be something better for us. Questioning the inverse of heaven and hell should not be myopically viewed as heresy, but rather addressing the system of the world that make life feel like hell. The hope is that heaven does exist. It's just as real as hell. However, the rhetoric of the sacred prophetic rhetoric is to seek the divine in the face of hell. It seeks to live beyond the confines of suffering. I got about 3 minutes. Let me skip. An important element of understanding the inverse of heaven and hell is dealing with the discourse of good and bad. Troy states, picture everything that you thought was good was really bad. The creation of a contrast between good and bad with what is socially understood. However, what constitute what is good? As he frames good and bad, he follows the discourse of what is good and what is evil. It is clear his equation of heaven in reality is good and hell, what is experienced, is bad, evil. Nietzsche notes that the association of what is good has little to do with altruistic actions. If the statement should be considered like Nietzsche, we must discursively trace where good has been derived. Within this framework, Troy is continuing in the same fashion. Whatever good tends to be is a tradition of ideals and morals that are handed down. In Nietzschean thought, good is ascribed to the strong, and bad is named based on the one who cannot live a life worthy to be considered good. The strong call this bad. However, as a result of a lack of strength, the priestly of the bad call the good life evil. Their piety becomes good. I got 12. Let me skip. Vice versa not only raises the hypothetical of heaven and hell, but also considers heaven as abstract and hell as existential. Freud states, if heaven was hell and vice versa, I have no fear. I didn't witness too much hell right here. First, we must consider what is implied by right here. Pastor Troy was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, through American history, has been a hotbed for racially charged hatred toward African Americans. As the city of Atlanta grew in the late 20th century, the city's consistent disenfranchisement of African Americans contributed to it in numerous ways to the city's growth. In fact, the song was released 5 years after Atlanta hosted the 1996 Summer Olympics. The city celebrated as the world descended upon Atlanta to display world-class athletic talent. However, the efforts to cleanse the city in preparation for the Olympics directly affected the Black community. The Red Dog Task Force was assembled to tighten up on crime and drug distribution. The drug bust, arrests, homicides, etc., that came as a direct result of this effort honed in on the Black community. Freud furthers this idea of living in hell with, if you see me cremated, that's my adaptation to the climate. Hell is often relegated to burning and an internal lake of fire. Troy does not leave this lake in the eschaton, but rather the heat is in the here and now. Atlanta's heat and humidity earned a trope of the nickname Hot Atlanta. The adaptation to the climate could be a double entendre of the literal weather as well as some of the cultural heat, racial tension, homicides, etc., that take place in Atlanta. Heat or in an area of being hot is usually associated with an imminent dangerous situation. If the block is hot, this is in reference to consistent gunfire in the community. On the other hand, if it's hot out here, it means the community is oversaturated with the police presence ready to make arrests if or any offense is necessary. All of these aspects represent the climate of Atlanta. Thus, his adaptation to the climate or being burned to ashes is because of the consistent heat around the city. I have about 20 seconds. Let me just do the conclusion. Such a close reading of this song unlocks an understanding of not just lyrics, but the poet prophet's social location. Further, this type of reading facilitates an understanding of how critical rhetoric comes from the community. If hip hop utilizes strategic teaching methods to take anthropological rhetoric and refine it into the technological, this effort would broaden not only the scopes of rhetoric, but also give voice to different communities in academic circles. All right, I'll yield there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Great presentation. Great presentations. Now comes our moment for for questions. So if you can, I know some people have been leaving questions in the comment section in the chat room, or if you can feel free to just unmute your mic and ask questions to any of our panelists. Somebody said, all right, someone said long question, but I'm going to try to read this long question. It is a long question. The Black preacher who stood as the oracle of hope for our grandmothers and not now witness a generation whose ears lean towards a different cadence, not of the pulpit, but of a stage. Could it be that the rapper has become the new prophetic voice? If, as Dr. J. Roberts proclaimed, there exists a prophethood of all believers or priesthood, must we not consider whether the lyricist too bears the mantle of truth-telling, exposing injustice in rhythms that resonate with the weary and the wounded? Is there a remedy for the profound spiritual disengagement from the Black church and growing sense of disconnection? I'm not sure who that's directed to directly. It might be you, Carl. But I mean, you can start there, and if the other panelists want to jump in, I think their work also can speak to that question.
Absolutely, and definitely Dr. First work as well can speak to this question. I'll start here. I think one of the things that would help, um, and this might sound sacrilegious at best, but I think we have created a marginalization as to who God can speak to and who God can speak through. And so then the question then becomes, what's more important, the message or the prophetic utterance or the actual messenger, right? So now we get into these ethical understandings of like, can God speak prophetically to just a nobody on the street? Well, that's the case of all of the Hebrew Bible prophets, right? And so we have created this central model or this paradigm that the prophetic utterance must come from the pulpit, when I would almost argue that that should be a shared space. And this is where I think Solomon's work can come in and call in a response in terms of affirming one's voice, that we can hear God through anything and through any means if it is indeed a prophetic utterance. And so I think the pulpit has its place, but we've been not just within the culture of hip hop music, but we often draw from from just what we would deem secular songs to affirm what God is saying. I think Dr. Johnson has a book in this in this realm. But so I would argue that the pulpit does not lose its efficacy or its power. It's just that we can hear God's voice in through whatever means or medium that God allows.
I would affirm. I mean, this is what Baldwin's getting at, right? He essentially has a 3-year pulpit ministry, and then he says, "No, I need to be a lyricist in other ways, right? I need to write fictional narratives that are in some ways autobiographical. I need to write these speeches and deliver these speeches, but they're not happening in churches because again, the prophet often has to denounce the institutions and the linguistic universes that are propped up by the churches, right? And then I just wanted to quote that earlier in the essay, I have this quote that I didn't get to read from Heschel. So he's talking about how this has always been the nature of the prophets. The prophet is not only a prophet, he is also a poet, preacher, patriot, statesman, social critic, and moralist. So anywhere, sometimes it has to come from outside the pulpit.
Yeah, and I ditto those sentiments. That's a lot what I was trying to allude to. I think that, the, the rhetoric that comes from the pulpit, I think, has its place, but I also think that the constraints of the institutional church allows you to only go so far. So it gives other people outside of the confines of the church a much more greater opportunity to say more, to
Yeah.
do more without being confined to what the institution allows you to do or says what you can do. So, yeah.
All right. Okay. Any other questions in the chat? Any chats, questions on the floor in the room? I do have a question for all of you, but we'll start with Tom. Can you or would you align this work or how or would you align this work of Baldwin as a type of what they say? Augustine says that something to the effect that the church is the whore and the church is my mother, or Martin Luther's act of, the 95 Treatises on the church's door.
Mhm.
That's really interesting. I think those two guys are doing explicitly theological work, and they're trying to justify the church, right? So they're trying to justify the church's existence, right? So Augustine is, as far as I know, like he's saying the church is a whore, but she's my mother. Like I can't leave her, but I need to recognize that there's like always going to be this unfaithfulness. But don't worry, like she loves you and she's good. And I don't know that Baldwin's there. I would say he's equally doing theology, but he's not doing theology as an apologetic for the church. So maybe there's like a subversiveness to it, like if there's a connection, but they're doing opposite things. Yeah, that's a super interesting question.
Let's see. Also for I'm sorry.
Yep.
John, you was gonna say something?
No, I think Michelle has a hand up. But I was just going to say it's always good, see, it's only at the Center for the Study of Rhetoric, Race, and Religion when church history comes up. So, just a little Augustine, a little Luther.
Right. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is the faithful role of violence in response to as a form of faithful resistance in the face of an oppressor that will not relent. And something that I've been tracking through multiple presentations is the idea of hope and the possibility of hope, and from where does that stem? And I'm just wondering if any of the presenters had some thoughts around the possibility of using violence as a faithful response to an unrelentant, physically violent oppressor. Whether or not like hope and the possibility of hope might rely on that, even in certain circumstances. That almost like there is no hope or possibility of hope unless the option of violence in the face of an unrepentant oppressor is at least on the table.
Well, for me, violence, when oppressed people are being inflicted with violence, the response, if it be violence, is always righteous to me. It's always a sacred act. So there's never not a time when it's not appropriate. If we're talking about what has happened and what's being done to oppressed people, it is another form of hope. And again, I feel like in the Christian space, you that gets, maybe we can take it there. It's not a unequivocal understanding. No, we're taking it there. So yeah, for me, violence is always an act of hope because it is a righteous indignation and response to what's being done.
Well, I would jump in and just comment on that question, Michelle, and that's a great one because it's something that we have to wrestle with. We need to remember that the Christian church has been the larger purveyor of violence. So when we talk about, well, it's not in the church, no, I think I can make a cogent argument to say that I am being more church-like if I'm violent, because the the preponderance of violence have been perpetrated by folk who claim to follow Jesus Christ.
Who said?
And so it is only in response to oppressed people when they are afflicted with violence that we even have a discussion of whether you should be violent or not. To respond in self-defense is an act of love,
Right.
because and is a response in love and respect and dignity, agency, purpose, mission, and all those words we like to throw around. But it's only in those kind of situations that we don't, bring them up. But yeah, I mean, the violence that the church has perpetrated on millions is just in the name of the church and in the name of Jesus, in the name of the bloodstained banner. It has just, like I said, you can just say, hey, I'm being churchy by doing this because this is what church has done. And I know, well, I'll stop there. But yeah, that is something that the prophetic rhetors that I studied in the 19th century wrestled with. And I am just reminded on Bishop Henry McNeil Turner's famous quote, Negroes get guns and pray to God your aim is straight. A good AME bishop.
I was just going to add to this discussion specifically for Baldwin. I think he has a trajectory that I think is similar to a lot of folks, right? So he starts off with kind of I think he always maintains this kind of abhorrence of violence, but things begin to change for him. I think particularly after James Meredith integrates down in Mississippi, and after he kind of sees like the violence there, like he becomes more. If I understand his story, he becomes more open to it, to the point that even in one of his fictional narratives, one of the black preachers ends up with a gun always under the pulpit, so that every time he steps up there to preach, he has self-defense readily available. So I can only speak to what the big picture of what I understand about Baldwin, but he seems to become more accepting of that possibility as a good, virtuous possibility as time goes on.
All right. We have another open question, so I guess this is for everyone. It says, referencing the prophetic voice, how can rhetoric in the Black sacred art and writing re-image or reimagine diversity and inclusion in the age of Trumpism, specifically concerning censorship around DEI?
So I'll just start off. I think the prophetic response is always going to be twofold. There's going to be a criticism of what is, and there's going to be a call to imagine what would be. So when it comes to DEI, I think part of what is going to happen is say, well, I think we had this conversation yesterday after Dr. Letter's presentation, right? When we talk about inclusion, like we have to be very specific and critical of what we mean by inclusion. We have to be very, very specific and understand when we talk about reconciliation, what we mean by reconciliation. I mean, I think Baldwin, will say at some point, like, there's no like, what was his quote? Something like, we can, what are we going to be reconciled to? Like, there's not this acknowledgement of this problem, right? So if we're included, in a culture that doesn't acknowledge that it is formed by whiteness, then this is not ever going to be sufficient for Black flourishing, right? So, but then is going to say, like, you have to also imagine what it could be. So how do you set a vision before people, a compelling vision, a compelling rhetorical vision that makes them come face to face with the beauty of the diversity of God's creation, that it is not that it is God ordained, that it is the eschatological end toward which God is taking us. So the prophetic vision is going to do two things. It's going to criticize what is. It's going to give us imagination and symbols for what could be. I'm just talking big abstract picture about prophetic rhetoric.
All right. Any Josh or Carl, you want to get speaks to that, or we'll move to the next one?
Yeah, I just really briefly, I think I know we're living in a moment where it seems like where Trumpism is actually a school of thought now, right? That we actually have to start wondering, thinking through as, as rhetoricians or whatever. I think from the side of, I guess, theology, within the paradigm of how scripture presents itself, there is always a Trump-like circumstance.
Mhm.
Um, and as a result of it, um, there's always tyrannical rule, and where James Cone would suggest that the voice of God is always heard on the margins. And so, through this lens, I would argue that, we've always had to reimagine our circumstances. We've always had to have that sense of reimagining, reinventing. That's what hush harbors were. The same ground, per se, on plantations. Our ancestors reimagined that ground to make it a place to where full ontological expression takes place. And so this art, or being able to reimagine a space or a place to where we can see a world that is paradoxically, it's a paradox because it's a contradiction, but then it's also imagining a thing that actually could be better. And that's what hope, I would argue, is rooted in. And so I think with that, um, I hate to say it's the same old thing. It's different. It has a different nuance now, but I think the prophetic voice will continue to flourish even in times like this.
Yeah, what they said. What they said.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. No other hands are up. I don't see any. Oh, hang on. No, no other question. All right, so I have what's my computers won't do this, won't do it. As far so Josh, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to uh look at some of this work, but when you were speaking, I started thinking about there's a book by Charles Cobbs Jr. The book is This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, and how guns made the civil rights movement possible. And I don't think they give, he actually was here on campus giving us a lecture and talking to the ideal that we don't talk about that civil rights movement does not literally having guns played a very intricate role and part in getting the work done that King and other civil rights leaders had embarked on. And so I didn't know if you wanted to speak to more to that, or if you definitely some work definitely that I think would add to what you're already doing.
Yes, I'm familiar with the book, hadn't gotten deep into it, but obviously that is a text that's gonna help fuel my research. And I didn't for today, I really didn't
Mm-hmm.
give that thought to center that text or even use as part of my presentation. But yeah, that definitely has to that yeah. Because when I think about that, I think then it leads me to think about, like the deacons of defense and things like that. It's like that's
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So thank you for that.
Solomon, if I can just jump in real quick, since you mentioned Brother Charles Cobb, he was, like you said, on campus a couple of weeks ago now, maybe, and I did have an opportunity to attend that talk and then have dinner with him. And it was great conversations, told so many stories. But in the book, the title comes from one of the people that Dr. King met as he was traveling and coming into his home to stay for a couple of nights, and they had to literally set up a perimeter around the house 24/7 just to, make sure that, other folk didn't have other ideas about coming in and, in the middle of the night or whatever. So, and when he introduced himself, hey, I'm Reverend King. The guy introduced himself and he just said, you know what, Reverend? That nonviolent stuff, and he ain't used stuff. That nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And Cobb was one of the SNCC workers that was in the room. He was traveling with King, going around getting people to register and stuff. And he heard that and said, and so that's where that phrase comes from. And I forget the guy's name, but he did mention him, and it's right at the beginning of the book where he talks about that. So I thought that was interesting that people on the ground. And this is again, this is what we really want to try to do with this center. We want to bring the voices from the people that have been on the ground that we may never have heard of, instead of having this kind of conversation here, which is good, which is no problem. But also, let's talk about what some of the folk were saying on the ground, and a whole lot of people, and I mean, if you grew up in a certain time, well, still now, if you grow up in the South and you're in a rural area, you had protection, and it was more than just the Bible. That just
Yeah.
I knew men and women that hey, you pick up a purse the wrong way, don't grab that now. Be careful. I mean, don't sit over there. As King told one, don't sit right there. You might want to sit over here. You just never know. And so people on the ground, that has always been my kind of starting point in rhetoric. Well, I guess I lend myself to prophetic rhetoric and discourse and stuff because I want to know what kind of intellectual acumen that was going on the ground. There's this kind of um, um, public theology, this public engagement, where people were really beginning to wrestle with, uh, their lived experiences. And I think we're at a moment right now. Somebody in the chat talked about what's going on now. We're at a moment right now that we have to reimagine and revision um, what it is that we've been doing, what we've been saying. And, um, since we're here, I'm just going to try to embrace it and try to discern my role in it. But it is an opportunity for us to really begin to reimagine and to start having conversations with people who are affected directly by some of the decisions that have been made from the people that's been on top. I think Tom trying to get in there. He went, that's a good scholar right there. He went and got a book, and he's going to give us.
Did
There
I
you
went and
go.
got I went and got my copy of the Fire Next Time because it occurred to me while we were talking that the second half of his autobiography, he encounters Elijah Muhammad, And if I remembered
Yeah.
correctly, they have a conversation about violence and hope. And fortunately, I had it marked on my page. So he says a couple of things. He says in the United States, violence and heroism have been made synonymous, except for when it comes to blacks. And then he says, he says the real reason that nonviolence is considered to be a virtue in Negroes. I am not speaking now of its racial value, another matter altogether, is that white men do not want their lives, their self-image, and their property threatened. It is as you were saying, Dr. Johnson, the nonviolent appeals are very convenient when coming from white folks. So while Baldwin finds the Nation of Islam in some ways quite lacking and doesn't find it appealing, he does seem to appreciate its emphasis on Black power and the possibility of necessity of violence even to preserve Black dignity.
Right. Let's see. We got 1 minute left.
Brother Chair. Oh, go ahead, Brother Chair. You can.
Oh, no. I was just gonna add share one thing with Carl when he was doing his presentation, and it took directly and if you haven't considered it, maybe consider it to Tupac's Blasphemy song album, or the Machiavelli album altogether, but Blasphemy specifically. There's a verse, the third verse just starts off, the preacher wants me buried. Why? Because I know he's a liar. Have you ever seen a crackhead? Now that's eternal fire.
Yeah.
Right. So
this whole notion of hell on earth, right? Yeah.
Right. That. So
well, listen, I think we've come to our time. We've come to our time. Y'all show some love to the panel, the panelists. Thank y'all for submitting. Thank you for being a part of this. Before we break for our 12 o'clock session, so please stick around for that. Lizzie Howard from Peter Lang Press is coming, going to be talking about publication. So you want to stick around for that, especially if you got a book or you got something that you've been working on. Speaking of books, I just want to shout out Brother Reverend Dr. Thomas Fuerst, Prophetic Pearl, just dropped, just hot off the presses, the rhetoric of 19th century African American prophetic call narratives. Get this book. I'm telling you, you will be blessed by it. It is a wonderful book. He had an awesome dissertation advisor that helped shape this early. Wonderful advice, just wonderful. I know him personally. And then he took that molded piece of clay, and then he just said, I'm just gonna put it over here and just write this terrific book. And here it is. And I am more pleased to shout this out. So there you go. Prophetic Pearl, the rhetoric of 19th century African American prophetic call narratives. You can learn more about prophetic rhetoric and call narratives and the lives of some very interesting people by taking.
I had an acknowledgments page where I basically said this book is entirely plagiarized from Andre Johnson, but for some reason they moved that, they just deleted that acknowledgments page. So anyway, thanks, Doc.
No. This is good. This is good. So, all right. Let's take our break, and then we'll come back at 12 noon for our discussion about publication.